Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Thursday, April the 28th, 2022. And I'm going to begin today by talking about Greta Thunberg. You remember her? The most famous woman, certainly the most famous teenager in the world. Let's see. She's won the Frit Ord Award, the Rachel Carson Prize, the Ambassador of Conscience Award, the Right Livelihood Award, the International Children's Peace Prize, Time Person of the Year for 2019, the Nordic Council Environment Prize, declined. Ooh, there's a story there. The Gulbenkian Prize for Humanity, and she is a Doctor Honoris Causa of the University of Mons. Famous for braids and for not talking, selective mutism, they call it. And then when she talks, she is typically angry, very angry, shouting, how dare you, etc. From a TEDx talk in Stockholm, November 2018, I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, OCD, and selective mutism. That basically means I only speak when I think it's necessary. Now is one of those moments. She has called her autism a superpower. According to Wikipedia, Thunberg says that she first heard about climate change in 2011 when she was 8 years old and could not understand why so little was being done about it. The situation made her depressed, and as a result, at the age of 11, she stopped talking and eating much and lost 10 kilograms or 22 pounds in 2 months. It sounds like she was starving herself to death. And then came the diagnoses. So she decided to campaign boycott school. I suppose this is what Greta Thunberg is most famous for, not going to school, the school strike for climate. Well, she's back in the news, or at least in Politico, in an unintentionally hilarious piece by Carl Matheson, and it is called Greta's Not Talking Anymore, or she doesn't want you to talk about her anymore. Greta Thunberg's childhood ended during the pandemic. Wow, that's a portentous opening. Just a few months before the arrival of the coronavirus, the Swedish teenager and her fellow activists had organized a march of millions, possibly the largest climate protest in history. But lockdowns put an end to the boisterous Fridays for Future school strikes, which Thunberg had pioneered and spread around the world. With entire countries in isolation, Thunberg's movement was paralyzed, recalled Dominika Lasota, one of the group's most prominent figures in Poland. The pandemic wasn't just a body blow for an organization completely reliant on momentum from the streets. For many of the activists involved, it also deprived them of a place to give voice to a shared dread, what kids in these times call climate anxiety. Is that really what the kids are calling it, Carl Matheson? It was in search of community as much as anything that Thunberg and her friends started hosting digital strikes on Zoom. The gatherings were sometimes loosely organized and sometimes barely at all. Oddly, for a bunch of kids considering the apocalypse, the vibe was all about having fun. Let's say a deeper thinker than Carl Matheson might conclude from this that these kids are not really terrified of the apocalypse. They weren't even work calls. Work calls? We would just play music and hang out with each other, said Mitzi Jonelle Tan, the convener of Youth Advocates for Climate Action's Philippines and a Fridays for Future organizer. In contrast to Thunberg's popular public image, which is largely based on the angriest segments of her speeches, those who know her describe her as warm, caring, funny, extremely blunt, and at times silly. Alongside the goofing, the Zoom calls had changed something fundamental about Thunberg's movement. Built around local marches started in Europe, the group had been dominated by white Northern Europeans. Boo! Concerned less about the present than the future. Suddenly, they were face to face with activists from around the world for whom climate change was real, pressing, and immediate. How exactly? struggling against a whole different set of challenges in places like Uganda, the Philippines, or India. They had different ideas about what it meant to fight climate change, and they were ready to call out the ignorance of their rich white friends. Disha Ravi, an activist from India, said she and others from poorer parts of the world were disturbed by their new friends' lack of understanding of the day-to-day realities of living with climate change, such as, in her view, the environment movement in general was pretty whitewashed. Ugh. And Fridays for Future was no exception. When back-to-back typhoons threatened Tan's hometown in the Philippines in late 2020, and as we know, it is only in the last few years that Asia has been battered by windstorms. No, it never existed before. Never existed before. So Western members sent through a list of emergency measures she could take. Fill the bathtub with water, they said, in case she was trapped in her home without drinking water. And I'm like, I don't have a tub. That's for like really rich people. And our tap water isn't drinkable, Tan said. They were so shocked by that. If your tap water isn't drinkable, where does your water come from? You're not drinking seawater, are you? They were so shocked by that. Even the name Fridays for Future, which Thunberg had started as a hashtag when her school strikes were still minor gatherings outside the Swedish parliament, was a crock. For much of the world's population, climate change isn't a future concern, said Tan. We're not just fighting for our future, we're fighting for our present. Oh, and let's give some examples here. On separate calls, activists from the global south and indigenous communities formed, yes, of course, the Swedes aren't an indigenous community, are they? Formed a group called MAPA, Most Affected People and Areas, and decided Fridays for Future needed to be reshaped if they were to be part of it. They organized decolonization trainings for their fellow activists, which Thunberg joined. We were holding each other accountable because we cared about each other as a movement, said Tan. Oh, conversations, huh? In other words, you sit down, you shut up, and I'm going to tell you how horrible you are and what you must do. Thunberg was a sponge. That's not a sentence I would have written. She started engaging more and more in the discussion groups. The pandemic brought all of us really close, said Ravi. One thing that grabbed Thunberg's attention was the difficulties other climate activists had in simply protesting. I understand, Thunberg said to Tan during a discussion about an authoritarian law in the Philippines. To fight for climate justice, you need to have democracy. The planet might have been closing down, but Thunberg's world was opening up. According to interviews with 10 of her closest collaborators and fellow activists, what she heard during those quiet, introspective months changed her and accelerated an evolution in the focus of her efforts. As the scramble for vaccines cast global disparities into sharp focus, yeah, guess what? It turns out that Africa and India don't want the vaccines. At one point, threatening to boycott the COP26 climate talks in Glasgow unless countries could attend on an equal basis. Eventually, the UK government responded to the demands of developing countries by rolling out a vaccine program for delegates, and Thunberg attended the conference. Speaking to a crowd outside the meeting in November 2021, Thunberg said climate change was being fueled by a system based on the idea that some people are worth more than others. What? It's naive, she added, to think the problem could be fixed using the same old methods and not addressing the root cause. What would the root cause be? Industrial civilization? Might that be the root cause? COP26 was a failure, she said, and returned to school in Sweden before it was even halfway through. Having gone stratospheric, at the age of 15 with a simple appeal to listen to the science, Thunberg, now 19, is being driven by a different message. Listen to the most vulnerable and help them build the fair future they demand. The seeds for Thunberg's conversion to social justice advocacy arguably go back to the very beginning of her activism, which was sparked famously by a feeling that she and the rest of her generation were being betrayed, given the cause and consequences of climate change. And those are, what are they? Why weren't responsible adults, parents, teachers, politicians doing more? Why was no one panicking? In her early teens, Thunberg became sick. She ceased eating and talking. Activism, both Thunberg and her parents have said, was her salvation. Yes, therapy, one might call it. It was also a process of finding and banding together people who shared her anxiety and her view that ultimately climate change is a moral question, right and wrong, or as she has said, black and white. And so it was only natural she was open to the ideas that others were being betrayed as well. One early turning point in her thinking seems to have taken place during a highly publicized trip to the United States in 2019. Thunberg had been invited by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to speak at a summit in New York, and rather than take a plane, she and her father had crossed the Atlantic in a borrowed racing yacht. Was this craft powered by wind? Was it? Jamie Henn, a self-described aging youth activist who helped organize her schedule, remembers being struck by how much Thunberg's approach contrasted with the hyper-racially aware politics of the U.S. youth environmental movement. When she first came and showed up in New York off the boat, she was really interested in just conveying the scientific urgency of what was happening, said Henn, who helped start the 350.org campaign group. He had suggested that she meet up with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the South Bronx, where communities of color are exposed to pollution. Carbon is not a pollutant. It's not that she wasn't interested, but I think it just wasn't really the priority, he said. He had the sense that Thunberg wanted to leave the political stuff to others because it was messier than the clarity of the scientific message. Then, in a way that foreshadowed her experience during the pandemic, Thunberg started to meet other young people, absorb their experiences, and adapt her worldview. At a meeting with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in the Congress, Thunberg found herself sitting next to Tokata Iron Eyes, a Sioux youth leader whose Standing Rock tribe were fighting against the construction of the Keystone XL oil pipeline. When Iron Eyes stood to speak, she pointed at a painting of Abraham Lincoln, a white man, boo, who had been responsible for the oppression of her ancestors. Why, she asked, should she trust Pelosi to deliver justice for her people? Iron Eyes sat down crying. Greta put her arm around her and sat with her, said Henn, who was at the meeting. Then, when it came time for the group to take a picture with Pelosi, which is clearly what Pelosi was looking for, Thunberg refused, preferring to stay and comfort Iron Eyes. Stunning and brave. She wasn't really interested in being in this photo with the Speaker of the House, which made, of course, her staff incredibly angry at me, Henn said. Pelosi's Deputy Chief of Staff, Drew Hamill, said the intention had been to hear from the activists. The focus was never a press op, and press was not invited. In the following weeks, Thunberg road tripped across the U.S. in an electric car loaned to her by Arnold Schwarzenegger. And of course, as we know, electric cars are powered by lightning. She and her father went to a cemetery in Lindstrom, Minnesota, a leafy lakeside town that calls itself America's Little Sweden. Founded in 1894 and named after a Swedish settler called Daniel Lindstrom. There, the neat, well-kept graves mark the prosperous lives of people who could have been the Thunberg's ancestors. The pair then drove to South Dakota and joined Iron Eyes at the Pine Ridge Reservation to visit the single stone memorial at Wounded Knee, where 300 Lakota people were massacred by the U.S. Army in 1890. Thunberg was struck by the contrast, by the disparity between two communities living at exactly the same time that was still playing out more than a century later. Yeah, could it be that the cultures, Minnesota and of Indian reservation in the Dakotas might have something to do with the people who inhabit each of these places? In a book coming out in the fall, according to someone familiar with the text, Thunberg said this 24-hour period gave her a new perspective on the world, one that she struggled to accept. Oh, you mean that some places in the world, or even in the same country, are richer than others? Greta didn't know this before? None of the countless activists, political figures, scientists, or writers who came before Thunberg had broken through in the way she did. Her fame had brought her all the trappings of the international superstar activist, top billing at the United Nations annual Nobel Peace Prize chatter, creepy death threats, Twitter spats with Donald Trump, and the opportunity to be pals with David Attenborough. But in her own bleak assessment, it all made little difference. The the perennial gloom of the Swede. They invite cherry-picked young people to meetings like this to pretend they are listening to us, she told a youth conference in Milan ahead of COP26 last year. Her appearances in the halls of power had been sensational, televisual, but ultimately just the right amount of discomfort for world leaders to endure. Politicians would leave the room believing, yeah, we just got flagellated by Greta, and I've been absolved of my sins, Hen said. The language she used to burn world leaders got co-opted, sublimated. At the address in Milan, Thunberg parodied their empty climate rhetoric. There is no planet B, there is no planet blah, blah, blah. 1 month later, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson told 26 that without actions, their words would be nothing but blah, 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 to coin a phrase. People have gotten really good at talking about the climate, said Hen. And so Joe Biden gets up there and says, this is code red for the planet, and I'm going to address it. And then they pass the buck on, can't get climate legislation done. There's a ton of greenwashing going on right now. To be sure, things have shifted in the era of Greta. Climate change is now a first-order geopolitical issue in the world of finance. It has been mainstreamed. And there seems little doubt that leaders like Johnson see themselves as committed climate champions and fellow travelers, even if Thunberg doesn't share that view. But it's clear from her public statements that Thunberg has given up on the politics as usual cycle of minor, fragile wins. One person familiar with her thinking said these incremental gains are considered worse than nothing at all. Greta's new messages of climate justice, making sure the burdens of climate change and the battle against it are shared fairly, is a harder sell in the halls of power than urging policymakers to follow the science. In UN climate negotiations, for example, demands by poor countries for compensation for the damage being caused by climate change have been successfully stalled by Europe and the United States for years. Oh, I don't know. Why don't they sue God for reparations for these typhoons? As an idea, it's also harder to communicate. As Fridays for Future has evolved, it has started to adopt the language of the global social justice movement, albeit with some internal reservations. During a disagreement over whether to use the phrase colonizers of the North when they returned to the streets in October 2021, Thunberg was the decisive voice, said Tan. She stepped in and calmly said, you should use it. Colonizers of the North, what does that even mean? But the consensus among campaigners is that no one, not Thunberg, not the MAPA activists who are growing in prominence, has yet distilled in it the searing manner of Thunberg's early stuff. Yeah, that's what they say about any band. You know, it's the first 3 albums that were great. And after that, you know, it was a long slide down. Meanwhile, the movement has dwindled. Many people who had responded to Thunberg's childlike demand for a fair future drifted away when the movement started examining what fairness would really require. We are fully aware that we're not millions on the streets anymore, said Lasota, the Polish activist. Those that remain say it was a necessary evolution. Who we are now to just always refer to the science, like listen to them and ignore us, said German Fridays for Future activist Luisa Neubauer. That, of course, is different now. As some of us at least grow older, we expected to provide some of the solutions as well. Those solutions include a demand for climate reparations. That involves handing back land to indigenous communities and transferring wealth and political power from the richest countries that cause climate change to those who will bear the brunt. Because, of course, climate change, it doesn't affect any other countries except what those in Africa or Asia. Somehow the temperature is particularly angry with Africa and Asia. For Thunberg, it also means straying into unfamiliar and sometimes scary territory, as in February last year when Ravi got involved in a protest led by Indian farmers against agricultural reforms. Oh, is that what that was? Perhaps you could give us a little more detail about protests against ends to government subsidies. When Thunberg tweeted out a document containing tips for online campaigning to support the farmers, the Indian government decided that her involvement was evidence that Ravi was involved in an international anti-state conspiracy. Ravi was arrested on charges of sedition, then released 9 days later on bail. Ravi can't talk about the case, which is still ongoing, but she said of Thunberg that the experience of mixing with activists facing repression really helped her understand how different it is to be a climate activist in different countries. And I think that's really why her perspective has changed. Thunberg did not want to be interviewed for this article, which is really the point, as Politico was reminded bluntly by several Fridays for Future activists. She doesn't want to be the face of this global climate justice movement. That does not mean she's stepping away from activism, her friend said. Although she has been talking about going to university after she completes her final year of secondary education, isn't she 18 years old now? She skipped a year to go to the US. Nothing seems to be decided, and activism still takes up vast amounts of her non-school time. For her friends, the media's continued fascination with Thunberg is both a powerful tool and a source of frustration. There have been several instances, said Ravi, where media played a role in who got highlighted and who was deliberately silenced. Several activists pointed to a moment before the pandemic in 2019 at the COP25 climate summit in Madrid, where Thunberg tried and failed to pass the mic. At a news conference organized by Fridays for Future, she made a brief, stuttering opening statement, then directed the media to listen to 6 activists gathered from around the world from the front lines of climate change. The media response could be summed up by a camera person's decision to keep the camera trained on Thunberg for a full minute, while Marshall Islander Karlon Jajok Zakras spoke out of frame about 16-foot waves that had forced people from their homes just days before. And of course, in the Pacific, they'd never had, big waves until really recently. Thunberg feels rightfully annoyed, said Ravi, but it's nothing compared to the annoyance of the activists alongside her. Yes, who is the most aggrieved? That's really the only pertinent question, isn't it? Just a few weeks after COP25 at the World Economic Forum in Davos, an Associated Press photographer edited Ugandan activist Vanessa Nakate, who is Black, out of a photo that included 4 white women, including Thunberg and Neubauer. In Nakate's response, a furious and sad video shared on social media, she said it was the first time she understood the definition of the word racism. While the setbacks have been painful, Nakate, Tan, Ravi, and other MAPA activists have launched their own careers. Careers? As what? And are gaining increasing prominence, according to media analysis shared with Politico by the Global Strategic Communication Council, which offers media support to Thunberg and other Fridays for Future activists. Nakate had a bigger media presence at COP26 than Leonardo DiCaprio or UN climate chief Patricia Espinosa. There's been a shift from where we began, but that's not where we hope to be, said Nakate. Those who are experiencing now, we are the ones who deserve to be listened to. Thunberg's push for climate justice also coincides with a wider reckoning, happening across the green movement. Environmentalism has a history of sidelining the voices of those most vulnerable to climate change on the basis that their demands were not central to the effort, said Tasneem Essop, a South African activist and executive director of Climate Action Network International. In fact, many times they were chastised for raising wider intersectional issues. We must really just fight the climate fight, she said. I've been in conversations like that. More recently, however, events like COVID and the murder of George Floyd in the US have raised awareness of inequality and forced a debate about what, or more pointedly, who, the environmental movement should stand for. This has created a deep and painful rift in the green movement between and within groups, according to senior green campaigners. Do you get a badge for that? You get a ribbon? You're a senior green campaigner? There's folks who feel like all of this is a distraction, said Han. But he said it was impossible to build broad public support for environmental ambition without wrestling with terms of social justice. It's deeper into this uncomfortable conversation that Thunberg and Fridays for Future are dragging the climate movement, said Essop. It is the youth that always ended up leading movements into a more radical space. As Thunberg has noted, not everyone pays the same price for inaction. The UN International Panel on Climate Change recently found that around half of humankind lives in circumstances that makes them extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Well, as it turns out, I live pretty much near the tip of a peninsula on an island. I think if all of the doom mongering is true, I would be extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But since I'm an old white man, I suppose that's not relevant. This long foretold splitting of the world into 2 futures called Climate Change Apartheid by Archbishop Desmond Tutu when Thunberg was just 4 years old has dire implications for more than 3 billion of the world's poorest people if global temperatures creep far beyond 1.5 degrees above the historical average, as they are predicted to do. Thunberg hopes an alliance with them can build the critical mass she needs to move past politics as usual. After one particularly bleak scientific report came out recently, she told Tan, Mitzi, we're going to fight together for every fraction of a degree. If the 1.5 slips out of reach, she added, the battle would turn to 1.51, then 1.52. And I will be here with you each step of the way, Thunberg said. It was exactly what I needed, said Tan. Yes, go woke, go broke, as they say. And so, yes, the climate change movement has now been subsumed by anger at white people. So it doesn't seem to have much of a future, except for these senior Green campaigners who have managed to turn this into careers. Presumably, rich people, foundations are paying for them to hold hands and weep together before shouting angry imprecations. That story was just so funny. Hello to Chogokin666, who says, scratched my eyeball. Sorry to hear it. Hello to Dan and Run. Dan says, did the climate doom goblin finally get ousted by her handlers at Davos? Hello to Dawn from Beyond. Dan, Palcaso88, Mercurius Aulicus. Hello to Buddy. Greetings, Midwest USA, baseball, light rain, etc., whatever. Let's broadcast. Kevin, the gallery longs for more tainter, says Buddy. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Can't restrain the taint. Shame how it put a stop to social contagion of climate change hysteria, says Mercurius. Sailor has gone off the deep end, Ukraine, says Palcaso88. Yeah. Okay, I love Steve. But was he paying much attention to the Ukraine before this year? Because big things have been happening in the Ukraine since 2014, when Victoria Nuland decided that the government of the Ukraine had to be replaced in an illegal coup d'etat and turned into a U.S. puppet state, very suitable for money laundering. Is Sailor like Gottfried Ukraine, says Buddy. Palcaso88 says it was 0 degrees Celsius when I woke up in Ottawa today, but climate change. And, Sailor tweeted that Ukraine is kicking Russia's ass today, says Palcaso88. No, they are not. I've almost stopped looking for news about what is actually happening on the ground in Ukraine, because the media has decided you're not going to get it. It's all, yay, Ukraine. You were the bravest people in the world, and we could learn so much from you. And how about that President Zelensky? Is he sexy and inspiring or what? That's what we get. Oh, also, we must pour billions of dollars into the rat hole, which is the Ukraine. Hey, weapons. Where are these weapons going to end up? Don't know, don't care. Hypocrite of the Gate says, unscrupulous development without regard to future flooding is the biggest issue in the third world. They will blame us for the flooding and demand that we pay to upgrade their infrastructure. Yo Mama says, hello. No one's panicking because we aren't autistic teenage girls. Hello to Brian Frakes. Bill McKibben started 360, I believe, 100% green grifter, says Dan. Environmentally friendly lithium strip mining, says Chogakin, a six. Last good Iron Eyes was Iron Eyes Cody, says David Wright. He was the famous crying Indian in 1960s TV PSAs about people littering. Who else do we have? Yo Mama says, my ex-girlfriend's mom had a protest sign that said there is no planet B. I told her there would be if we had listened to Werner von Braun. Anyone else? Hello to Dawn Willis. I like Swedish fish. And I'm just hello to Tarot Destroyer. Celebrity worship is in decline. I wish I could agree with you. And I've been saying for a long time, it would be best if these celebrities decided to take a lower profile, but nope, they're not having it. Paula Berlinski, is the earthquake shaking? Is there going to be war? Tell the National Guard to mind the grocery store. Mick Jagger wired all night. If the Marshall Islands don't want 60-foot waves, they shouldn't let Lena Dunham do cannonballs off the pier, says Picasso 88. Hillary Clinton, I admire Margaret Sanger enormously. Her courage, her tenacity, her vision. I'm really in awe of her. There are a lot of lessons we can learn from her life, says Paula Berlinski. Margaret Sanger was very much exercised with the problem of non-white people having babies. And she thought that this was a very bad idea and decided to devote her life to making sure that there were as few non-white babies being born as possible. Paula Berlinski again, Martin Luther King Jr., who gratefully received the Margaret Sanger Award from Planned Parenthood in 1966, said, there is a striking kinship between our movement and Margaret Sanger's early efforts. Hello to Dancing Man, who says, grateful at 49 to have Greta keep me aware of my moral failures. Hello to David the Gnome. And he was actually Sicilian. Yes, Iron Eyes Cody. Yes, I'm trying to remember the famous Indian in Canada. Pierce Brosnan starred in a movie about him, and he was an Englishman, not an Indian at all. He fooled a lot of people, though. Okay, so we are going to talk now about, oh yes, the economy. And I guess it's all Russia's fault or something. This is from Portfolio Armor as Zero Hedge. The political class is starting to get spooked by Biden's wobbly economy. In Politico, Ben White worries that corporate CEOs will pull back on investment in light of uncertainty about the economy, sparking a self-reinforcing cycle of economic weakness that will doom the Dems in November. Corporate America's concern about the future is also reflected in polling data showing consumers losing confidence in the economy and in the ability of President Joe Biden and the Democrats to manage the nation's finances, especially on inflation, now at a 4-decade high. That skittishness also suggests investment could sag further in the second quarter and beyond. Uppermost in CEOs' minds, the impact of higher inflation and continued disturbance in their ability to deliver their products. White saves his scariest quotes for last from Goldman Sachs CEO David Solomon and Baird analyst Ross Mayfield. Well, U.S. employment levels are low and wages are increasing. Inflation is the highest it's been in decades, Solomon said. We're seeing new stress on supply chain and commodity prices, and U.S. households are facing rising gas prices as well as higher costs for food and housing. We've also seen an increased risk of stagflation and mixed signals on consumer confidence. Wow, stagflation. That takes me back to the 1970s and Jimmy Carter. Stagflation is something that economists insisted right up to the bitter end was not possible. There could be no such thing as stagflation. That is a stagnating economy and roaring inflation. And guess what? It happened. And it's happening again. If inflation continues to rise like this and wages don't rise as fast, then something is going to roll over, Mayfield said. The consumer will not survive it. In a timely post before the market's epic puke session Tuesday, Zero Hedge shared a warning from Morgan Stanley chief U.S. equity strategist Mike Wilson. In his latest weekly warm-up note, Wilson drops all pretense of cautious optimism and turns all in bear, writing that with defensive stocks now expensive and offering little absolute upside, the S&P 500 appears ready to join the ongoing bear market. And while his formerly favorite sector defensives can still outperform, he warns that it's just a relative trade at this point. Well, I'm sure Raytheon and other defense contractors are doing quite well. I mean, wouldn't you think? Peace sells, but who's buying, as they say. Let's talk about Jacques Ellul. I'm reading from Wikipedia here. He was born in 1912, died in 1994, was a French philosopher, sociologist, lay theologian, and professor who was a noted Christian anarchist. Elul was a longtime professor of history and the sociology of institutions on the Faculty of Law and Economic Sciences at the University of Bordeaux. A prolific writer, he authored more than 60 books and more than 600 articles over his lifetime, many of which discussed propaganda, the impact of technology on society, and the interaction between religion and politics. The dominant theme of Elul's work proved to be the threat to human freedom and religion created by modern technology. He did not seek to eliminate modern technology or technique, but sought to change our perception of modern technology and technique to that of a tool rather than regulator of the status quo. Among his most influential books are The Technological Society and Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitude. And I'm going to read here from an essay from the Substack Seeking the Right Thing. And this was published yesterday. Introduction to Technique. Once you read Jacques Ellul, it is impossible to escape the conclusion that reforming the systems and mechanisms that govern our society, both in the public and private spheres, is never going to fix the problems of our society. We are, down to the very core mythology of our culture, a technological society. It colors how we look at the world, how we approach problems, and it fuels our constant desire for solutions. Humans have always been tool using and technological, but at some point a shift occurred. Once we were masters of our tools, they were a means to express our skill, creativity, and humanity. We have since become mastered by them, such that we are ruled not just by technology and machines, but by technical systems and technical thinking, such that all problems are essentially technical in nature and depend not on us as human beings being better, but rather on the perfection of the technical system. Ellul helps us to understand this transition and what it means, not just for politics, but for human flourishing in general. When we think of technology, it is natural for us to do so by focusing on devices and machines and their effects upon us. There is merit to this. Examinations of the effects of, say, the automobile and the mobility this machine brings are useful avenues of inquiry. What is the meaning of the car? Commonly today, we consider the effects that computers, the internet, smartphones, and social media have on us and our society. Again, these are good questions to ask, and the answers are important to know. But Ellul argues that the technologies we implement are actually less important to understand than the ways of thinking that give rise to the making of machines. In fact, Ellul argues, technology is the final step in a chain that begins elsewhere. He calls this way of thinking technique. If there is one thing I hope you take away from this piece, it is an understanding of technique and technical thinking. We must understand that technique is very much an integral partner to the idea of progress. Progress is achieved through technical advancement, not just in the area of machines and devices, but also through the implementation of systems. Essentially, the idea of management that has its roots in early time and motion studies is the application of technical ways of thinking to social and organizational problems. Scientific management, as it was once called, is essentially a technical enterprise. If you wonder what the link between a phenomenon like woke capital and government bureaucracy is, it is at this level of a sharing a fundamental worldview. All problems are essentially technical. Social problems are technical. Business management problems are technical. Once it is determined that there is a society-wide problem, it is only natural to harmonize all technical systems in order to manage the problem. As Ellul says, technique has now become almost completely independent of the machine. In truth, he takes it a step further. The machine is entirely dependent upon technique, and the machine is now not even the most important part of the machine. The truth in this last sentence is the one most necessary for us to see and interiorize. Technique and technical thinking has taken over all of man's activities. It is not just a thing of productivity or science or the making of machines and devices. Technical thinking is what integrates human beings into a machine society. Technique both paves the way for the machine and integrates humans into the use of the machine. Technical thinking constructs the kind of world that the machines need. What kind of world is this? It is a world that values efficiency. It wishes to bring efficiency to all human activity. We must be ever more productive. To achieve greater productivity, everything must become more efficient. To become more efficient, every human action needs to be standardized. Humanity is made to fit the world of the machine. Humans become an extension of the machine, an efficient and productive cog in the great technical system. Technique is the model. The ideal and its attributes are valid once and for all, for everyone. Our social mythology understands technology as the product of scientific discovery. We have this mental picture of scientific advances being made that then find practical, often commercial applications which can be marketed to buyers. This, argues Ellul, is backwards of how it actually works. Quote, everyone has been taught technique is the application of science. This traditional view is radically false. Technique comes first, unquote. What Ellul notes is that most advances in scientific discovery first required a preceding technical advance that then made possible new areas of inquiry. Technique and technology make possible the experiments that then allow scientific knowledge to advance. He goes so far as to say that when the technical means are not there, science is completely unable to advance. It simply does not happen. Quote, without technique, science has no way of existing. If we abandon technique, we disown the domain of science and enter into that of hypothesis and theory, unquote. Without the technical means to test a theory, scientific theory remains just that, theory. In fact, scientific inquiry has been so superseded by technical activity that it is impossible for us to think of science at all without the notion of technical application. The two, science and technology, have essentially been collapsed into a single thing. Science is the means to technology, and technology is the means to do science. In the ordering of the two, the purpose of science is to realize technique. Science is the handmaiden to technology and technical thinking. Because technical thinking is the foundation of scientific thinking, and scientific thinking has become the aspiration of all disciplines of learning, technique comes to be the foundation of every aspect of society. Quote, what Toynbee calls organization and Burnham calls managerial action is technique applied to social, economic, and administrative life, unquote. Ellul argues that Burnham's managerial revolution is the societal expression of technical thinking extending itself further and further into society. The influence of technique is the standardization of everything. Standardization means resolving in advance all the problems that might impede the functioning of an organization. What Ellul wants us to see is that thrust of technical thinking is to remove human variance from the outcome by standardizing all activities through policy, through computerization, through methodology, through systems. The idea that all activities can produce standardized outcomes regardless of which human beings are within the system. We can standardize outcomes in manufacturing, customer relations, teaching, as well as social problems like poverty and racism. Everything has a technical solution. Once the processes of that technique are refined, we can garner the outputs we desire, regardless of whether those outputs are widgets, student learning, ending poverty, or winning wars. All problems are technical in nature, and all problems have a technical solution. Quote, we can be confident that the final result will be that technique will assimilate everything into the machine, unquote. Ellul argues that the Greeks, from a cultural perspective, a society obviously brimming with knowledge and skill, rejected technique because they valued self-control and a certain conception of life over the brute force that technique represented. To use tools was in fact the highest form of human expression. It was a form of self-mastery. The idea that use of tools would supersede personal mastery of the tool, this would have seemed alien to them. In this light, Ellul argues, we have to understand that the technical movement rose up in an environment where the culture had already withdrawn significantly from the dominant influence of Christianity. As Christianity receded, technical thinking filled the void that the Christian faith once did. Ellul argues that the Christian faith had traditionally impeded the emergence of technical thinking. There was a number of features of it that had suppressed this. Christianity condemned the love of money and luxury. Renunciation was seen as the spiritual ideal. Attachment was seen as hindrance to the development of faith. Eschatology, the understanding that Christ would return and bring an end to this world, was more important than the achievement of practical ends in the here and now. If this world was going to pass away, there was not the felt need to perfect life today. Without this desire, there is no need to perfect technology. The question, is it righteous, was asked of every attempt to change transitional techniques and modes of production. Change, when it happened, was slowly introduced and subordinate to its effects on the social and spiritual climate of the people. Ellul argues that the process of breaking with this worldview began with the Protestant Reformation. In its attempts to return to primitive Christianity, it ended up undermining the social restrictions to technique. From the time of the Reformation, the next decisive step in the development of a technical society was during the French Revolution. Here you had a state emerge that was fully conscious of itself and was autonomous in relationship to any prior religious or social conditions. It was able to focus on implementing systems and processes in order to achieve specific outcomes. Quote, it was a period of rationalized systems, unified hierarchies, card indices, and regular reports. With Napoleon, particularly, there was a tendency toward mechanization, which resulted from the application of technique to more or less human spheres of action. The revolution also entailed the exertion and regrouping of all national energies. There were to be no more loafers, no more privileged sponsors, no special interests. Everyone must serve in accordance with the strictures of technique, unquote. Ellul identifies 5 basic factors necessary for the transformation of a society into a technological society. 1, there is a long incubation period of technical experience and gradual technical improvement that primes the pump for a tipping point. 2, population expansion. 3, there is a suitable economic environment. 4, there is a period of social plasticity. And 5, the appearance of a clear technical intent. Christianity, up to this point, had ordered society around Christian aims. All of the aspirations were secondary to these larger faith pursuits. Christian society was more important than the technical. As long as that moral order is stable, then anything new will have to be tested against this order. But once the Christian social order began to break down, the clear Christian intent of society was quickly replaced with a clear technical intent. In a sense, technique and technical thinking was essentially sacrilegious in the Christian era. Ellul describes the pre-technical society this way, quote, the individual found livelihood, patronage, security, and intellectual and moral satisfaction in the collectives that were strong enough to answer all his needs, but limited enough not to make him feel submerged or lost. They suffice to satisfy the average man who does not try to gratify imaginary needs if his position is fairly stable, who opposes innovation if he lives in a balanced milieu, even though he is poor. This fact, which is so salient in the 3 millennia of history we know, is misunderstood by modern man, who does not know what a balanced social environment is and the good he could derive from it, unquote. All the obstacles that this balanced environment placed on technical proliferation disappeared at the time of the French Revolution. For an individual in an atomized society, all that is left is the individual and the state. The state is the sole authority, the highest authority. The state in this environment becomes omnipotent. The growth of the state is aided by this technical drive for standardization, for finding the one best way to do everything and anything. As you may have guessed, the primary actors in the breakdown of the old feudal and monarchical system, the urban bourgeoisie, merchant, and professional class, were the main drivers behind the introduction and proliferation of technical thinking, and with it, the introduction of the machine. It was precisely because technique made the bourgeoisie money that they became so committed to technique and machines. It has remained this way ever since. The stewards of this class interest has shifted from the owners to the managers, but the impulse is the same. Their power is rooted in their unwavering commitment to the technical mindset. This is a very long essay, and I'm not going to read any more of it, but I will commend it to you. Again, it is from the Substack Seeking the Hidden Thing, and it is called Technique, Propaganda, and the Left Liberal Nature of Western Society. I should have mentioned, in talking about Greta Thunberg, that perhaps her friends in Asia and Africa would think a little differently about their goals if they realized that the destruction of the industrial society of the West will mean a vast Malthusian die-off in Asia and Africa. Because in Africa, Africa does not produce anywhere near enough to keep these people alive. It is the surplus, or formerly the surplus, created by the capitalist West, and now it's just borrowed money or conjured into existence, that gets sent to Africa in various forms of aid, most importantly, food aid. If it comes to the point when, because of the shutting down of industry over an imaginary crisis, that there is no more money to send to Africa, that politicians, I don't think, are going to say, you are going to have to starve so that people in Africa don't starve. Well, the Africans are going to start dying off in the hundreds of millions and beyond. And I can recommend another essay on Jacques Ellul from the Substack, the Nim Stack by Nirma Chiragi, The Sorrows of the Technical Man. My first article was a book overview of the Technological Society by Jacques Ellul. It truly has been one of my favorite books, and I see it as the best explanation as to why modern society makes us feel so ill. I want to cover this subject a little more in this article. I recommend you read my book overview before you read this article. People have come up with many different explanations as to why things have become the way they are. Why are some poor and others rich? Why is everyone so depressed? Why are our states crumbling? Explanations vary from corporate greed to poison in our food, social justice, etc. And in many cases, they are all correct, but they are only secondary explanations. They say nothing about why there is poison in our food in the first place. You can chalk it all up to capitalism, but it isn't like things were much better in the Soviet Union. The answer you are looking for is technique. Ellul doesn't give a direct definition of technique, so I'll try my best to provide one. In a sentence, technique is an all-consuming, autonomous, and decentralized force that seeks ultimate efficiency at any cost. So what does this mean? Let's start with autonomous and decentralized. What I mean here is that there is no central authority to technique. Technique isn't managed by the government or a corporation. These entities might fulfill technique, but they don't decide what technique is. When Frito-Lay installs new machinery or implements a new seed oil, it isn't because they want to, they need to. This is what is meant by all-consuming. No entity is above technique. Technique rules over all entities. The government has no ability to control technique. Can you remember the last time the government meaningfully stopped some sort of biomedical endeavor on ethical grounds? Maybe they're evil and don't want to, but it's more likely they are unable to. Doing so will block the path of ultimate efficiency. In this way, technique takes over the liberal order that enabled it in the first place. Technique should not be misinterpreted for the machine or what we might call technology. These are both parts of technique, but not what technique is. Human resources are parts of technique as much of the machine is as our laws, mathematics, universities, schools, etc. And again, this is from the NIMStack Substack by Nima, N-I-M-A, Chiragi, C-H-E-R-A-G-H-I. Thinking about technique with regard to COVID-19, okay, so we have this new respiratory illness from the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus. What to do, what to do, what to do. Well, obviously something must be done, right? Something's got to be done. Well, why not just wait it out? Oh, we have mathematical models, since proved to be utter rubbish, that demonstrate that there's going to be some sort of holocaust if something is not done. How about vaccines? Yes, but vaccines typically take a long time. Nope, we're going to get these vaccines with warp speed. And we're going to give indemnities to the companies that come up with vaccines, so they're not responsible for any side effects. So everyone has to get this vaccine. Well, what about people who say, I don't think this is a big enough problem? And frankly, this mRNA technology has never been used in this way before. And this is not a traditional vaccine. In fact, the Centers for Disease Control actually changed their definition of what a vaccine is in order to accommodate the mass rollout of mRNA technology. And was there much thought given to what might happen? That maybe, it wouldn't simply be a case that these vaccines were almost perfectly efficacious and almost perfectly free from risk? That we considered that possibility? No. Something must be done. Technique says, let's create a vaccine as fast as we can and force everyone to have it. And we will punish. We will bribe people to get the jab, and we will punish people if they do not get the jab. We will shut down your businesses. We will fire you. We will make you an outcast in a society. Let's go back to the chat. Don Willis says Dunkin' Donuts or Krispy Kreme. Neither of those companies are where I live. John Vicente says Gray Owl. Yes, that was his name. David the Gnome says, I remember watching Rome on torrent in college, and me and my roommate would smoke green, and neither of us could follow the plot or the names, and it was basically indecipherable nonsense. Well, I mean, there's two parallel narratives, right? Oh, we have the world of the two soldiers, and then we have the political world of Rome, and these two soldiers interact with great figures in history, such as Julius Caesar and Cleopatra and the like. I found it very exciting. Sam B says, so cool to meet up sometime somewhere with eye patches. The cast and crew of the movie John Wayne was working on when he won the Oscar for True Grit lined the road wearing eye patches when he returned. David the Gnome says, yes, eye patches are cool. Sam B says, as much as I wish KMG the greatest success, I do like this group and its size. It's cozy, says David the Gnome. Now they are reporting that Madison Cawthorn is a gay, says Oscar. Oh, golly. Would anyone be surprised by that? I mean, again, when this fellow's name first came into the news, I decided to read about him, and I thought, oh my God, this man is just so totally compromised. Do elites believe they can model human behavior, says Helper? Indeed, they do. They've been hammering Cawthorn for that, which means what he said is probably true, says Oscar Ito. Che Blutarski says there's likely going to be a mass die-off in the Dark Continent at some point. Well, yes. Again, when your population explodes and you are not producing enough to sustain that population, yes, a mass die-off. Long before artificial contraception, Africans used natural techniques to repress their fertility because, the folk wisdom had it. There's no point having a great number of children if most of them or almost all of them are going to die. That would be a pointless endeavor. Chokin 666 says Russian forces rocket strikes on targets in Kyiv proper. David the Gnome says, my sister had 3 shots and she just got COVID like 2 days ago. Are people still actually getting these shots? Well, it's my understanding that the number of vaccinations has dropped dramatically. GSP, hello. A new name to me, says still pure blood here, and here, too. Popcasso 88 says, anyone going to see Top Gun Maverick? Is my understanding that Tom Cruise is still a fighter jockey after all this time, that his hot-headedness has kept him in that position? He doesn't rise in the ranks. This seems really highly ridiculous to me. So it's most political policy directed by behavior modeling. Well, I think it's, there's certain assumptions built in. For instance, immigration. We need immigration. Why do we need immigration? Because more people is better than fewer people. Is it? Really? There's an assumption there. We need immigration for diversity. Oh, why do we need immigration for diversity? Because diverse societies are stronger than non-diverse societies. No, they are not. So immigration of radically different people to the West brings about problems. Well, we can fix that. We have social programs. We have GIBs, and we have propaganda that the reason for these social problems caused by third world immigration is white supremacism. And I am now going to, yes, you asked for it, you got it. Joseph Tainter, The Collapse of Complex Societies. The region on the marginal product curve depicts a realm in which a complex society experiences increased adversity and dissatisfaction. Stress begins to be increasingly perceived, and if modern history is any guide, ideological strife, for example, between growth and no-growth factions, may become noticeable. The system as a whole engages in scanning behavior, seeking alternatives that might provide a preferable adaptation. This scanning may result in the adoption by segments of the society of a variety of new ideologies and lifestyles, many of them of foreign derivation. In this part of the curve, increasing complexity may actually bring decreased overall benefits, as the economic system and the sustaining base are taxed to the point where productivity declines. All segments of the society compete for a shrinking economic product. This is a realm of extreme vulnerability, as a major perturbation or stress surge will impinge on a society that has inadequate reserves. Surplus production for investment in research and development has declined. The scanning behavior of the previous stage may be terminated, as the hierarchy imposes rigid behavioral controls, as in later imperial Rome, in an attempt to increase efficiency. As a society evolves along the curve, it traverses a continuum of points where cost for complexity are increasing, but the benefits have actually declined to those previously available at some lower level of investment. Thus, the benefits derived from investment are no higher than those available previously, but the marginal productivity of this latter point is far preferable. A society at this point is in serious danger of collapse from decomposition, as well as from any external threat, as constituent social units recognize that a strategy of severing their ties to the regional entity might yield highly increased marginal productivity, or however it may be conceptualized. The resulting rebellions and peasant wars further weaken the policy. At such a point, rapid disintegration of the type that Renfrew predicts from the topological mathematics of catastrophe theory is likely and expectable. One important question is why an equilibrium situation does not develop when marginal productivity can no longer rise. Why can't a society that has reached some optimum cost-benefit ratio for its investment in complexity simply rest on its accomplishments? While long-term equilibrium may be possible in comparatively simple foraging societies that are demographically flexible, it is less likely in more complex settings of greater density. Hunter-gatherers typically have the option of dispersing under resource shortages so that population density is lowered in a distressed area. So long as new land is available, agriculturalists often have this same option. Where demographic and or social political factors limit the option of dispersal for a large segment of a population, though, the solution to stress must often be greater economic and or socio-political investment. Since all human populations experience recurrent stresses, complex societies must constantly develop organizational features designed to alleviate new problems. To the extent that such problem solving requires greater organizational investment, following the argument developed in this chapter, marginal returns on complexity will ultimately decline. Much of the foregoing may read like the doom and gloom that issues from the Club of Rome. Economists and others will rightly ask whether all of this is really inevitable, or whether some salvation, such as technical innovation, can stave off collapse and permit continued growth. Tied up in all of this is the question of the future of contemporary complex societies. Although contemporary societies will be discussed, this is deferred for a later chapter. For now, the matter of innovation and growth, particularly in regard to ancient societies, will be briefly addressed. Technical innovation, particularly the institutionalized variety we know today, is unusual in human history. It requires some level of investment in research and development. Such investment is difficult to capitalize in an agriculturally based society that produces little surplus per capita. Technical innovation often responds to labor shortages, which in the ancient world were the exception. As a result, technical development in societies not based on a fossil fuel economy tend to be minimal. Where technological innovation in ancient societies did occur, it often tended actually to depress the productivity of labor. Jim Kunstler talks about this problem a great deal, and has for a long time, that economic growth was based on cheap oil. Well, oil is no longer cheap, and it is no longer going to be cheap, for the reason that oil projects now are typically stupendously expensive, offshore projects especially. We're talking about billions of dollars being spent before any drilling begins. Now, you have a whipsaw effect that the price of oil has risen tremendously recently. And as Kunstler points out, that oil above a certain price, let's say $80 a barrel, tends to crater the economies. So the price of oil collapses, as it did a few years ago. But then, of course, more demand, cheaper oil enables more demand, which of course leads to price spikes. And so the cycle, up, down, up, down, up, down, continues. Now, growth. We all believe that growth is important. The GDP is practically worshipped. Why? Why is growth so important? In a static population, population numbers are static. There is really no need for growth at all. Without immigration, to go back to that subject, there would be no population growth at all in our Western countries. But growth is the God that we worship. We never ask ourselves why we must worship this false idol. The Austrians argue that there has been actually no real growth in America since around 1970, that the supposed or putative growth is actually the result of government borrowing. And I'm inclined to agree with that. This often leads to strange situations. A few years ago, when the collapse in the price of oil hit Alberta, the province of Alberta, like a thunderbolt, Alberta became the fastest growing economy in Canada. And you ask yourself, how could that be so? Because the government of Alberta, the NDP government, was borrowing more money than any other province in Canada per capita. And so the growth that we see since the 2007-2008 economic crash has been entirely artificial. And our politicians, for some reason, they're incapable of understanding that this so-called growth is entirely artificial and it cannot be sustained indefinitely. In fact, we might even find out even this year that this is the point where the system stops working. Back to a tainter. Technical innovation, particularly the institutionalized variety we know today, is unusual in human history. Yes, where technical innovation in ancient societies did occur, it often tended actually to depress the productivity of labor. In industrial societies, technical innovation responds to market factors, particularly physical needs and economic distress. It is not, though, always the panacea that is imagined. In the input-output analysis of the U.S. economy from 1947 to 58, corrected for inflation, Carter found that technological change or progress had actually added about $14 billion to the task of satisfying the same final national demand. Technological innovation, as discussed above, is subject to the law of diminishing returns, and this tends to reduce but not eliminate its long-term potential for resolving economic weakness. Using the data cited by Wolfel, Scherer observes that if research and development expenditures must grow at 4 to 5% per year to boost productivity 2%, such a trend cannot be continued indefinitely, or the day will come when we must all be scientists. He is accordingly pessimistic about the prospects for long-term productivity growth. Colin Renfrew correctly points out, in the context of discussing the development of civilization in the Aegean, that economic growth is itself susceptible to declining marginal productivity. For human societies, the best key to continued socioeconomic growth and to avoid or circumventing, or at least financing, declines in marginal productivity is to obtain a new energy subsidy when it becomes apparent that marginal productivity is beginning to drop. Among modern societies, this has been accomplished by tapping fossil fuel reserves and the atom. Among societies without the technical springboard necessary for such development, the usual temptation is to acquire an energy subsidy through territorial expansion. The occurrence of this temptation runs the gamut from simple agriculturalists to great empires. Whenever the marginal cost of financing a social system's needs out of a local yearly productivity becomes perceptibly too high, this solution must seem attractive. The force of this attraction need hardly be argued, for the rise and expansion of empires provides one of the most unequivocal touchstones of history. Such expansion, where successful, has at least the short-term advantage of providing the subsidy sought, as the accumulated reserves of the subject population and a portion of their yearly productivity are allocated to the dominant polity. When some new input to an economic system is brought online, whether a technological innovation or an energy subsidy, it will often have the potential, at least temporarily, to raise marginal productivity. In the long run, however, marginal returns will ultimately begin to decline again for the reasons discussed throughout this chapter. In the curve produced in figure 20, this represents the point where, under the pressure of diminishing returns, a productive technological innovation or a new energy subsidy is adopted. Marginal productivity starts to rise for those aspects of complexity related to acquiring and initially developing the subsidy. This may occur immediately or after some delay, as in Wilkinson's account of a coal-based economy. Ultimately, though, another point of declining marginal returns is reached, presaging further innovation and expansion or collapse. The curve presents a more realistic expression of the economic history of some societies, but this only emphasizes the recurring problem of marginal decline. I could mention computers in this respect. There's a story that Steve Jobs attempted to sell the Apple computer to Hewlett Packard. He wanted them to develop this. And so he'd worked for Hewlett Packard. He was friendly with management. And he had a meeting and explained the virtues of it. And they told him no. Well, why? Well, we've done some research on this. And we have determined that there were only 7 people in the entire country who would have use for a personal computer. Well, starting, I suppose, in the late 70s, with the introduction of the IBM PC, all businesses were computerized, which resulted in greater efficiency and greater economic output. But it seems that we have run to the end of this, that computers continue to get faster and more powerful, although not as quickly as they did, and we're running into natural limits with silicon there. But everyone's had computers now for decades, and there's no more efficiency to be wrung out of them. And I want to talk about Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who I find a very amusing man. He blocked me on Twitter because I was greatly humored by his continuous attacks on Europeans. We're all a bunch of savages, squatting in the dark, eating porridge with our fingers, or as the Mediterranean, the Lebanese people, the Phoenicians. And he just wouldn't stop about this, that, if one examined, Mediterranean society, the Eastern Mediterranean, circa the year 1000, and compared it to conditions in Europe, in England or in France or in Germany, yes, they lived much better, more comfortable lives. But Europe caught up and surpassed the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, Taleb went completely nuts about COVID-19 because, of course, he would. That the world's going to come to an end. And now he's not happy about Elon Musk. Not happy. Taleb tweeted, "Simple economics, letting Twitter become the mecca for COVID psychopaths, Bitcoin loonies, alternative medicine quacks, Russian agents, and promoters of sinister racist theories will destroy the value of the platform. Why? When I buy The Economist, I do not expect Fox News." He seems to have misunderstood the whole point of Twitter, but he continues. "And unless Twitter keeps curating and trimming some offensive groups, the uneducated bon chic will go elsewhere. They have larger wallets, better targets for ads for Rolex watches, or the deluxe edition of the Inserto. QAnon are poor hand-to-mouth losers. That's economics." Yes, how can you tell the worth of a man and his thinking? How many Rolex watches does he own? This is pretty much what he's saying. Richard Hanania responded, "We had a pretty much censorship-free Twitter until 2015 or so, and elites didn't go anywhere. Twitter was still becoming the center of politics. It just did more mental damage to Julia Jaffe than it does now. Network effects and the usability of the platform are what matter." I commented, why does Nassim Nicholas Taleb buy The Economist? It's neoliberal twaddle. And someone on Twitter who follows me said, you answered your own question. Yes, Martian Orthodox. Yes, as they say, to ask the question is to answer it. Let's go to the chat. Where does Taleb live? I believe he lives in several places. Just let me check and see if I can find any information about that. Go to Wikipedia. It's weird. Some people don't have, a personal section in their wiki entries, and I don't understand why most people do, and some people don't. So no, I don't believe that I can answer that question for you. But again, so back to the chat. Burton Sultanov says the warmest people in our building, in my experience, were the Iranians, the Turks, and the Russians. Quachulango says, I can remember when The Economist was great. I stopped reading The Economist when they took up globalization, that the world will become ever more, globalized there. And, this is science. There's nothing that can be done to stop it. Oh, no? Oh, really? Globalization is the new Marxism. It purports to be, scientific theory. And really is just an excuse for bullying and for certain people to benefit at the expense of others. Oscar So says, all these intellectuals seem to fall off in a big way sooner or later. I have no idea why. It could be that a lack of new stimuli. When one is young, one is exposed, often involuntarily, to all sorts of intellectual stimuli. As one grows older, and certainly as one has more control over one's consumption of intellectual ideas, one tends not to stray very far from what makes one comfortable. Hello, Halper. Repeated early life checks equals red flag. Quachulango says, heard it said this week that Turks and Iranians don't give a toss about dogma. Yeah, this varies. It varies. Professor Pohl told us that the Kurds, whom he lived among for several years, were in no way fanatical Muslims. Anran says Talib is a joke. Who else do we have here? All right. I think I want a fat Danish, says Oscar Toe. All right. Yeah, what simps who pass law granting equal rights, says Birkin Sultanov. The boomers are blamed for a lot of things, and they're certainly guilty of a lot of things. I am a boomer myself. However, my generation did not come up with the lunatic idea that all people are equal. No. That was the greatest generation, or the silents, who came up with this lunatic notion. My generation did not come up with the lunatic notion that men are practically indistinguishable from women. No, that was the greatest generation and the silenced. And KMG, like that Jean-Jacques Ellul, says Quachulango. I know he was a thinker, and there've never been many thinkers. The people that we call thinkers, our intellectual class, are just people who regurgitate in their own style, if they have a style, what is the reigning narrative, really. I mentioned this before, but Marshall McLuhan, he wrote once that, people say that I can see into the future. He said, I can't see into the future. The advantage I have is I can actually see the present, whereas almost everyone else simply looks back to the recent past. They are not understanding what is happening now. Hello to Pete Bauman. And okay, I am going to now talk about a piece by Paul Gottfried in American Greatness. And it's about that hicklib Kevin Williamson at National Review. In an invective that could easily have appeared at Salon or Huffington Post, National Review's wannabe voice of conscience, Kevin Williamson, refers to the Republican Party as, quote, the yellowest, most timorous, most gutless, grasping, worthless, indefensible, chicken shit political organ the world has ever seen, unquote. It seems, however, that Williamson is condemning the Republicans for something they got right. They refused to expel from the ranks U.S. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia's 14th District, someone whom Williamson describes tout court as a ghastly cretin and self-serving malicious dunce. Williamson laces into Greene for morally violating the 14th Amendment. Oh, can these amendments be morally violated? And by being engaged in insurrection or rebellion on January the 6th. He believes this to be the case, even if Greene's guilt would be hard to prove legally. Although there are good grounds for treating January 6th as an insurrection under law, he insists, apparently Joe Biden's Justice Department does not see things this way. It's a funny kind of insurrection where the people taking part in it don't bring guns. They didn't occupy the Capitol. Trump told them to go home, and they went home. What is this occupation? What is this insurrection? I mean, you could fairly call it a riot, but insurrection, no. Back to Gottfried. Greene, a, quote, shabby grifter, as Williamson sees her, expressed sympathy for the imprisoned rioters and stands with those zealots who don't believe that Joe Biden, I'm not going to repeat that. If Biden's attorney general decided to prosecute some of the more influential election skeptics as complicit in insurrection, other opportunities would avail themselves for dealing with treasonous Americans. Merrick Garland could investigate troublemakers in the media, e.g., Tucker Carlson, Miranda Devine, Julie Kelly, filmmaker Dinesh D'Souza, and American Greatness contributors who share Greene's skepticism. Why let any of these insurrectionary skeptics off the hook? Williamson has always been a persistent never-Trumper, so it's no surprise that he should continue his vendetta against those who supported his bête noire. Since the much-noted illegal entry into the Senate building on January 6th is not being elevated as what it supposedly was, namely a full-blown insurrection, the case for disqualifying Greene's candidacy recently heard by a U.S. District Judge Amy Totenberg, the even more radical sister of Nina Totenberg of NPR fame, has no firm legal basis. In this suit, Greene is accused of engaging in insurrection by rhetorically challenging the declared election results. Oh, you mean just like the Democrats did in 2000 and in 2004 and in 2016? Williamson must reject that charge since the Biden administration has sadly not declared the events of January 6th to be a rebellion against our lawfully elected government. Because of the pussyfooting Garland, a coward who is not up to his job, according to Williamson, Williamson must turn to the people of Georgia's 14th District to vote their congresswoman out of office. Both patriotism and self-respect require them to make that decision. Gottfried comments, I wonder, yes, I am being facetious, if Williamson would treat the Summer of Love in 2020 as an armed insurrection. Cities were then pillaged, policemen and shopkeepers of all hues assaulted and killed, and government buildings vandalized and burned. Meanwhile, Democratic leaders such as Kamala Harris and Representative Maxine Waters stoked the fires by publicly defending the rioters. Not wishing to be left behind, Joe Biden's staff ran to bail out imprisoned vandals, while all Democratic hopefuls deplored the white racism and police violence that allegedly led to these so-called incidents. Would Williamson rage against such black congressional firebrands as Waters, Cori Bush, or Sheila Jackson Lee, all of whom have said far more provocative things than Greene has said and did so amid escalating racial tensions? If Greene's questioning of the 2020 race and her sympathy for those imprisoned indefinitely for the January 6th break-in were insurrectionary, how should we process Bush's entirely unproved allegation that white supremacists shot at her during the Ferguson, Missouri disturbances in 2014? Is inciting racial riots or making up lies about Trump's Russia collusion as wicked as what Greene did? If not, why not? allow me to answer my own question. Williamson would like to be seen as a no-holds-barred journalist, but tries very hard not to step on too many leftist toes. For example, he produced a famous broadside against white victimization in which he avoided mentioning non-white welfare recipients among those he considers a social burden. Williamson also has no trouble decrying Trump supporters as insurrectionists, but avoids pinning that label on leftist congressmen. For me, Williamson's tear against Green was truly over the top. He is unfairly slamming a gutsy congresswoman who was deserted by members of her own party when the Democrats stripped her of committee assignments in 2021. This is the same Congress that allows such morally compromised Democrats as Eric Swalwell and Maxine Waters to sit on powerful committees undisturbed. Fortunately, Green won't need my vote because her electorate appreciates her feistiness. The appeasers at National Review admit that with deep regret. Yes, Kevin Williamson came from some no-account place, and I suppose his circumstances were low, and he's exceedingly bitter about that now. Oh, I've moved to the big city. I'm an important person. I live where the real people live, not those horrible, horrible rednecks. This is from Nicole Silverio at the Daily Caller. Elon Musk is prohibited from criticizing Twitter via tweet in a clause of his $44 billion buyout agreement with the company, an SEC filing shows. The agreement, finalized Monday, states that Musk shall be permitted to issue tweets about the merger or the transactions contemplated hereby, so long as such tweets do not disparage the company or its representatives, unquote. Musk seemingly tested these boundaries in a Tuesday tweet, responding to podcast host Sagar Enjeti's commentary on Twitter's lawyer Vijaya Gadde, reportedly crying at a virtual meeting over the deal. The Tesla CEO publicly ripped the platform for locking the New York Post account in 2020 for sharing a report on Hunter Biden's laptop. Suspending the Twitter account of a major news organization for publishing a truthful story was obviously incredibly inappropriate, Trump said. Well, I don't know. I mean, are they going to take the money? I assume they're going to take the money. That's what they're in business for. Well, it's supposed to be what they're in business for. I mean, that's what they tell their shareholders. The board is supposed to have a fiduciary duty to the shareholders. This is from Steve Watson at Summit News. Conservative Twitter users have noticed a massive uptick in followers and engagement following Elon Musk's Twitter buy, while leftists on the platform are experiencing the inverse, prompting some to wonder if the company is undoing evidence that it rigged the reach of people it deemed to be undesirable. The trend is so extreme that it prompted Twitter to address it, claiming that it is all organic, owing to new accounts being created and existing accounts being deactivated. We've been looking into recent fluctuations in follower counts while we continue to take action on accounts that violate our spam policy, which can affect follower counts. These fluctuations, appear to have largely been the result of an increase in new account creation and deactivation. And I mentioned this previously. On the day Elon Musk announced his Twitter takeover, 200,000 Katy Perry followers deactivated. Marjorie Taylor Greene gained 90,000. Twitter confirmed to NBC News it wasn't bots. Apolitical users fled, right-wing users joined. This is from Ben Collins' Twitter account. Donald Trump Jr. had tweeted, "While I'm awesome and totally deserving of 87,000 new followers a day, it seems that someone took the shackles off my account. Wonder if they're burning the evidence before new management comes in." And Victor David Hansen has a piece in American Greatness called "Tearing Down the Silicon Valley Wall." The country is ready for a revolution, and Musk believes he can lead it with his Silicon Valley sledgehammer. Hang on just one second. People on the balcony speaking loudly. Elon Musk has finally managed to buy Twitter, Hansen writes, and the moment he did, the enraged left flipped out. Abruptly, leftists began trashing their favorite electronic communications platform as the domain of the nation's elite professional classes. Had they just discovered that they'd been racist and privileged users all this time? And what happened to the left's former worship of Musk as the man who revolutionized the clean, green automobile industry with his Tesla electric car company? Or Musk, the space revolutionary and hip Star Trekker, who with his own money helped ensure the United States remains preeminent in space exploration? Or Musk, the patriot, who is providing free next generation internet service to the underdog Ukrainians fighting Russians for their lives? No matter. The left reviles Musk because he has announced that Twitter will be the one social media platform whose business is not to censor or massage free speech in an otherwise monopolist, intolerant, and hard left Silicon Valley. Who knows? Musk might even allow former President Donald Trump to communicate on Twitter in the fashion that the terrorist Taliban, Iranian theocrats, and violent Antifa protesters all take for granted in their daily access to Twitter. But how did this once free speech antitrust let it all hang out left become a Victorian busybody, a censorious Soviet, and an old-fashioned robber baron monopoly? When it discovered that few Americans wanted left-wing socialist politics, it turned elsewhere. It found power instead through control of American institutions, from academia and Wall Street to traditional and social media. When Musk merely talked about buying Twitter, the left shrieked that an outlier multi-billionaire owning a media, and especially a social media venue, was unfair. The buyout was supposedly dangerous and a threat to democracy. But the more the left screamed, the less people listened. After all, left-wing Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook has roughly 15 times more market capitalization than Twitter. It has an audience of 2 billion users, over 7 times larger than Twitter's 271 million. Zuckerberg's monopoly on global social media and his enormous wealth were stealthily put in service to the Democratic Party in the 2020 election. He reportedly infused nearly $420 million of his media money into warping the vote in key precincts by augmenting and absorbing the work of state registrars to empower likely left-wing voters. Amazon's Jeff Bezos, the second wealthiest man in the world, owns the influential Washington Post. It has moved markedly to the activist left under his patronage. Multi-billionaire Lisa Jobs, widow of late Apple founder Steve Jobs, owns The Atlantic. It has become an increasingly hard left political magazine. So in Orwellian fashion, apparently most media-owning left-wing billionaires are good, but one social media-owning non-left-wing billionaire is bad. From the outset, it was clear that Hunter Biden's lost laptop incriminated his dad, Democratic nominee Joe Biden. Joe Biden was referenced by his own quid pro quo grifting son variously as the big guy and Mr. 10%, a full partner in peddling Beltway influence to rich foreign actors. Yet in lockstep, social media banned most coverage of the pre-election laptop story. It instead spread the standby false narrative of Russian disinformation. We know now the laptop was always authentic. The crude efforts to suppress mention of it were classic politicized news suppression. Indeed it is. And, in other places, this would result in people on the streets, tearing up cobblestones, forming barricades, and the like. But no, we were told by the regime media that everyone loves Uncle Joe Biden. Everyone has always loved Uncle Joe Biden. Well, what a jolly, likable, fun person he is. Well, I've followed Joe Biden for an awfully long time, and people do not like Joe Biden. He's an obnoxious, angry jerk, and always has been. Here's a story by Anya Caradeligia. I'm sure I got that wrong. Facebook could block news in Canada over revenue sharing bill, executive says. Rachel Curran, the public policy manager for Canada at Meta. Rachel Curran, that name is familiar. Didn't she used to work for Stephen Harper? I think she did. So we have a war between Facebook and the Canadian government, and we may well have a war between Elon Musk-owned Twitter and the Canadian government. Don't say I never give you any good news. This is Brian Flood from Fox News. MSNBC host Joy Reid's Readout finished April with its smallest monthly audience in the far-left program's nearly 2-year history. Readout averaged 1.1 million viewers during the news-heavy month, a 31% decline from April of last year. She also shed 11% of viewers who tuned in last month, and a staggering 51% compared to the show's debut month of July. 2020. Readout has also lost 57% of her total audience among the advertiser-coveted demographic of adults aged 25 to 54 since the program launched 2 years ago. This is a strange story. And again, I got caught out by a parody yesterday, and I'm sure I'm going to continue to be caught out by parodies because reality has become so insane that if you postulate that such and such a person said such and such a crazy thing, well, why not? Why didn't that person say or do that crazy thing? This is from the Daily Dot. Cecilia Lenzen. Try walking on the street and don't move aside for the white people. Woman of color refuses to move for white people on sidewalk in viral video. A woman of color on TikTok shared a video of herself refusing to move for white people while walking on a sidewalk. What happened was a shock to viewers. The woman, known as Katie Grace Jacobs, shared the video as a stitch to another TikToker's, Olivia Chow 69, advice. The latter TikToker shared a viral video of advising people of color, especially women, to refuse to move for white people when walking and see how many of them move out of the way. The people who take part in this sort of lark are the same sort of people who are constantly, making the claim that the entire purpose of the universe is to frustrate their every desire to expose them to violence, verbal and otherwise. Are these people looking for fights on the street? But you're going to block the sidewalk? Let's block the sidewalk and see what happens. I'm sure nothing bad could happen. Jacobs decided to try it, saying she'd never noticed that many white people don't move for others. Boo, white people. In her video, she covers her mouth and gasps and laughs. The TikToker walks down a sidewalk and has to navigate between other people who refuse to move for her. She appears to bump into people as a result. Several times when I was young, the expression cruising for a bruising was quite popular. The TikToker's video went viral with about 1.3 million views as of Tuesday. Jacobs wasn't the only one who said they'd never noticed this before. Are we going to hear about sidewalk equity now? We've had washroom equity or toilet equity from women. Yeah, if you go to a sports game, the lineup for the women's washrooms is much longer than for the men. Golly, I wonder why that might be. And so a whole bunch of these people said, yes, evil white men. They never move for you. They're always blocking the sidewalk. So let's just slam into them, and see what happens. I'm just reminded that what George Costanza once said, we're living in a society here, but maybe we're not. And so from Libs of TikTok, race-obsessed TikToker films herself walking around not moving out of the way as a form of micro reparations. So we see this quite attractive young Black woman who I think the purpose of this video is actually to show off her outstanding décolletage. She is doing this in Paris, of all places. Okay. And she's about to show these, these white Parisians what's what. And she's quite pleased with herself, I suppose, because there is much footage of her heaving bosom. Again. Society is in a dark, dark place. This is from Brendan O'Neill at Spiked, How the Trans Ideology Dehumanizes Women. Grace Lavery's bonkers book shows just how sexist trans thinking has become. If you want to find out about Grace Lavery, go to Kiwi Farms. And this woman might be crazier than Brianna Wu, which is saying something. I've seen some gaslighting in my time, but this new book from transgender professor Grace Lavery takes the biscuit. It is almost entirely about Lavery's penis, as confirmed by its title, Please Miss, a heartbreaking work of staggering penis. And yet, if any of you dare to refer to Lavery as a man, you will be branded a bigot. It is page after depressing page about Lavery's Johnson. Okay, and yeah, okay, I'm not going to read this. It's too disgusting. Despite all of this penis talk, anyone who says he must be a bloke then will be denounced as a foul transphobe deserving of cancellation. It goes on about, and I'm not going to repeat that. Imagine Jay from the In-Betweeners getting a PhD in queer studies, and yet woe betide those who refuse to bow down to the idea that this penis-obsessed person obsessed with his penis is in fact a woman, literally, legally, actually a woman. I have never liked the term male privilege, O'Neill writes, but it's hard to know what other term to use to describe a man writing a book about his bell end. He uses that word while fully expecting that everyone would acknowledge his womanhood. He uses that word too. His womanhood is his most cherished thing, he says, which I found shocking because I had assumed it was his Johnson. If male privilege means anything, surely it is the fact that a dude can publish a book whose front cover features a photo of him with a 5 o'clock shadow and an iffy wig and still demand that everyone refer to him as Miss Lavery. Even my use of the male pronoun in this review will be considered by some a heinous act of anti-trans bigotry. But if you think I'm going to say she and her about someone who describes becoming aroused, I'll put it that way, while watching Riverdale, and who goes to the sperm bank to, no, I'm not going to repeat that either. Lavery is an associate professor of English at Berkeley in California, and here Brendan O'Neill utters a profanity. He takes the name of the Lord in vain. I won't repeat that. This book is about his gender transition. It is one of the most misogynistic books I have ever read. The way it talks about women and their bodies is repellent. Okay, I'll repeat something I said a few days ago. It seems to be a surprise to a lot of people, who I think should know better, that these trans people hate women. We're the women now, they say. You will bow down to us. We can tell you what being a woman is all about, whereas you cishats or TERFs had better keep your mouth shut or we'll shut them for you. And I was talking about yesterday the subject of who owns children, whose children? Well, more on this subject from Nick Arama at Red State. Biden's brain breaks, then what he said about kids in school will make parents shudder. At this point, I wonder what the Biden staff must be thinking every time they let him loose and he starts talking. They must collectively hold their breath and hope he doesn't mess up too much. But unfortunately, their fears frequently are realized. On Wednesday, Biden gave some remarks during the White House event to honor the 2022 National and State Teachers of the Year. But apparently, he spoke at a point when he said he wasn't supposed to. Quote, I'm not supposed to do this. I'm not supposed to speak now. Then he went off. Then he said he was going off script. My staff's going, why aren't you giving the speech we wrote? I always expect, the next sentence to be in stories about Joe Biden. And then he angrily demanded a pudding cup. Biden told the assembled teachers that he had to really listen to them, as I know Senator Cardona has been doing. Miguel Cardona is Biden's Secretary of Education, not a senator. Biden just forgot what the title of his own cabinet secretary is. Cardona was never a senator. Then Biden went on to talk about teaching, learning, and students. So, of course, he had to talk about his own teaching as a professor at the University of Pennsylvania after he left being vice president. He spoke about how hard it was, except he never taught any classes. He gave a few talks on the campus, and for that, he got around $900,000. According to a compilation of Biden appearances by the Daily Pennsylvanian, Biden visited campus at least 9 times. One of his visits was a November 2017 event promoting his book, Promise Me, Dad. The other Biden visits included Q&As with UPenn administrators, one lecture to Wharton Business School graduate students. What could Joe Biden possibly instruct Wharton Business School graduate students about grifting in the Ukraine and China, and public events with former Mexican President Felipe Calderon and former UK Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg. Would that we all had such a hard job. Then he revealed a basic problem of leftist belief that the children belong to the village or the government. They're all our children, Biden says. Very creepy, especially from a man who likes to grope children. He continues to say that the children belong to the teachers. Quote, they are not somebody else's children. They're yours when you're in the classroom, unquote. Joe, they are somebody else's children. But that's what they think. That's why they think they can dictate over the parents and what the parents want for the children. It's the very thing at the heart of so many of the cultural fights in which we are immersed. But who did Biden see as the victims in the culture wars? Teachers. During the teachers' event, President Biden criticized books being banned, quote, to score political points. American teachers have dedicated their lives to teaching our children and lifting them up. We've got to stop making them the target of the culture wars. Will somebody please think of the groomers? We have stories of horrible things what the Russians are allegedly doing in the Ukraine. Planned Parenthood is on the case. You know what the Ukraine needs more than any other thing? I know you're going to say, weapons and maybe, NATO troops on the ground. Turns out that's not true. This is from Newsweek, Khalida Rahman. Abortion pills and emergency contraception are being sent to Ukraine as reports of rape since Russia's invasion continue to rise. Emergency contraception had widely been available in Ukraine, but the war has destroyed local supply chains and displaced many Ukrainians. To meet the demand amid increasing reports of Russia's alleged use of rape as a weapon of war and the broader turmoil of the war, the International Planned Parenthood Federation has sent some 2,880 packets of emergency contraception, commonly known as the morning after pill, to the Ukraine. Russia has denied accusations of rape and other human rights abuses by its soldiers. Just never forget contraception. Contraception is the most important thing in life. If not for contraception, where would we be? And to return to my benighted country of Canada, this is from Harrison Faulkner at True North or TNC.news. Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino repeated disproven claims about the Freedom Convoy to justify the Trudeau government's use of the Emergencies Act to crack down on the peaceful protest in Ottawa. Mendicino and Attorney General David Lametti appeared before the Special Joint Committee on the Declaration of Emergency Tuesday to defend the government's use of the never-before-used act. While answering a question about why the government decided to resort to such extreme measures, Mendicino falsely claimed convoy protesters posed a threat to Ottawa residents and were connected to the highly publicized arson attempt in a downtown apartment building. People who live in apartment buildings find that their front doors are locked and that fires are set in the hallways and corridors, Mendicino said before Conservative MP Glenn Motz interrupted on a point of order and corrected the Liberal minister. How would these truckers in Ottawa be in a position to lock people out of their apartment buildings? No, they're just going to lie. And the media, of course, the Canadian media, is paid for by the Trudeau government. So, in effect, they are owned by the government, not just the CBC, even Thomson Reuters. Gets money from the government. And they're very scared now of bikers in Ottawa. This is from the Canadian Press. Ottawa's interim police chief is warning that a planned biker convoy warning a planned biker convoy that the city will not tolerate any form of short-term occupation of the capital. Occupation. Oh, okay. If tourists, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of tourists descend on a town, spring, summer, autumn. Is that an occupation as well? Bell says organizers, interim police chief Steve Bell said organizers of what is built as the Rolling Thunder Convoy have said that they plan to leave the capital by Sunday, and the chief adds his officers are ready to act if they see signs of encampments or other plans to stay. Golly, there are encampments of so-called homeless people in every major city or in city of any size in Canada. Somehow the police don't seem to be very exercised by this, notwithstanding the fact, that various forms of violent abuse are rife in these places. Yes, Universal Mental Retardation, Canadian edition. This is from Amanda Connolly at Global News. An earlier version of this story stated MPs unanimously voted to recognize Russian atrocities as a genocide. That was inaccurate. The motion to do so received unanimous consent and was adopted, but did not receive a formal parliamentary vote. Okay, thank you for that. The Canadian House of Commons on Wednesday unanimously backed a motion to recognize Russian President Vladimir Putin's butchery and brutality during the invasion of Ukraine as genocide. These stupid people have no idea what genocide means. That would mean that any country that went to war against another country and killed civilians would be guilty of of genocide. And I'm thinking, which country is constantly going to war with other countries and killing large numbers of civilians? The United States of America. NDP MP Heather McPherson put forward a motion following question period seeking unanimous consent for all parties to recognize the atrocities as a genocide. The motion was adopted. The motion is not binding and does not carry direct consequences under broader international law, where their definition is laid out by the United Nations and its International Criminal Court. Neither of the latter venues has formally recognized Russia's atrocities as genocide, though investigations on that question have begun in recent weeks amid global outcry, as Russia's retreat from areas of central Ukraine lays bare a trail of suffering and brutality. I don't think that these people like Amanda Connolly, they don't need to write these stories. They could just get them straight from the PR department of the government of the Ukraine. Or just, the government of the Ukraine could just set up a template where, various numbers or names could be added to it and then just print it off. Yes, of course. We all believe that the Russians are guilty of these horrible, horrible things in the Ukraine. How do we know that? How do we know that? We don't, actually. Steve Saylor was mentioned previously. Here's a piece that he wrote 4 days ago. The improvement in jetliner safety among U.S. commercial airliners since the 20th century is remarkable. Following looking at this list of airliner fatalities, it appears that exactly one passenger has been killed in the big U.S.-owned Boeing or Airbus jetliner in the 20 years since the last catastrophic American passenger jetliner crash in Queens in 2001. But you'll be glad to know some people are working on fixing that unbroken problem. From the New York Times, the end of the all-male, all-white cockpit. Piloting is stubbornly monolithic. About 95% of airline pilots in the U.S. today are male. Nearly as many are white. Boo! Zakia Percy is one of a small and growing number of people trying to change that. Saylor comments, similarly, few Black women used to write op-eds, and thus the crucial topic of hair touching was criminally op-edicized. Obviously, we need more Zakiyas piloting jetliners in order to change the status quo. What was so bad about a few hundred or a few thousand passengers dying annually? Scott Kirby, chief executive of United Airlines, said the pilot shortage for the industry is real. Most airlines are simply not going to be able to realize their capacity plans because there simply aren't enough pilots, at least not for the next 5+ years. Oh, if airlines want to make the most of the thriving recovery from the pandemic, they will have to learn to foster lasting change. Saylor comments, in other words, the CEO at United wants to pay lower salaries to pilots, so he's willing to increase your risk of dying. Yeah. Okay. I was reading some information about a black pilot who crashed his plane, First Officer Aska, Flight 3591. And this is a very sobering story. It turned out that this fellow had washed out at airline after airline after airline, but he kept being hired. Why? Well, to ask the question is to answer it. As he pushed the plane farther into a dive, Aska shouted, "Whoa," followed by the desperate exhortation, "Where's my speed? My speed?" Believing that the plane was in a nose-high position and in danger of stalling, he might have been confused as to why his speed was increasing instead of decreasing. Within seconds, his sustained inputs on the control column disconnected the autopilot and pitched the plane over to nearly 50 degrees nose down, sending the 767 diving toward the ground from 6,000 feet. Yes, he just, well, let's see. I'm just scrolling down here to find out all of the, oh, yes, okay. Over the next 11 years, Aska worked for no fewer than 7 different airlines. After leaving Air Turks and Caicos in 2011, he was hired by Commute Air to fly the de Havilland DHC-8, but resigned before completing the training course, citing lack of progress. In 2012, he began training for the Bombardier CRJ-200 with Air Wisconsin, but again, he did not complete the course. Records show that he resigned for so-called personal reasons. He eventually returned to the EMB 120, which he flew for 2 years at Charter Air Transport. Then in 2014, he switched to Trans-State Airlines, where he flew the Embraer ERJ 145, but he failed a line check later that year and resigned, again citing personal reasons. Between 2015 and 2017, he flew for Mesa Airlines, this time on the ERJ 175. He attempted to upgrade to captain, but was unsuccessful. Finally, in July 2017, he was hired by Atlas Air to fly Boeing 767 cargo planes, which he did right up until the crash. At first glance, the sheer number of different airlines on his resume and the unusually high number of resignations already raised some eyebrows. Scrutiny of Aska's records from all these airlines revealed numerous training difficulties. First, he failed to complete training at 2 different airlines. Then at Trans-State Airlines, he failed an oral exam on the ERJ 145, then failed a check ride, a graded flight with an instructor, in May 2014, followed by a failed line check, a regular line flight but graded by an instructor in August, after which he resigned. In May 2017, at Mesa Airlines, he failed to upgrade to captain. In September 2017, at Atlas Air, he failed his Boeing 767 type rating exam due to unsatisfactory performance in crew resource management, threat and error management, non-precision approaches, steep turns, and judgments. After most of these failures, he went to remedial training and eventually passed. To learn more about what he failed so many times, the National Transportation Safety Board interviewed the examiners and check airmen who had graded him. The Atlas Air check airman who failed First Officer Aska on his Boeing 767 type rating examination told the NTSB that Aska lacked situational awareness, over-controlled the airplane, was, quote, very nervous, did not work well with the other pilot, and forgot to perform emergency checklists. Aska was constantly behind his airplane, and his actions would catch him by surprise. When confronted with something unexpected, he would panic and start pushing the wrong buttons. The check airman worried that the failure was so traumatic that Aska would not be able to mentally recover. Next, the NTSB interviewed the check airman who had trained First Officer Aska at his previous employer, Mesa Airlines. According to 3 instructors at that airline, Aska had no trouble with rote tasks. However, they confirmed that when faced with an unexpected event, he would start pressing random buttons in order to feel like he was doing something. Another told the NTSB that despite all the evidence to the contrary, Aska didn't think he was a bad pilot, or at least he was unwilling to admit it. Every time he failed, he came up with an excuse, blaming his poor performance on the hotel where he spent the night, his simulator partner, or the instructor. He had no idea that he lacked basic airmanship skills, refused to accept feedback, and didn't understand why he couldn't upgrade to captain. So here we have a man who, quote, lacked basic airmanship skills, but after washing out at airline company after airline company. Hey, why don't you come and work for us? Yeah, we'd be pleased to hire a pilot who lacks basic awareness of what a pilot is supposed to do. And I suppose so. United Airlines has decided, yeah, that is the future of your future in the skies. To have people like Aska in the cockpit, going crazy with terror and just pushing buttons at random. Okay, let's have a final look at the chat. Hello to Ogan's Iron. Oh my God, total cargo cult plus Kruger Dunning. Too many buttons, says Gamion. Well, yeah, cargo flying. I guess, they didn't trust him with people, but, there's often other people who get killed. The rest of the crew say. Gamion says, well, we're suicidal as a civilization, so pilots without piloting ability should be normal. Did you hear about the attendant who had her teeth knocked out by a diversity passenger, asked Burton Sultanoff? No. Cubana Airlines is also one of the worst, says Burton Sultanoff. Diversity is our number one priority, says Anrun. Burton Sultanoff says African airlines have the worst safety records. I remember Shiva Naipaul in his book North of South, when he's flying to Kenya, he finds himself in what was formerly the Belgian Congo, and a considerable amount of apprehension, about flying on an African airline. And he was told when he flew from London to Kinshasa, I think, and then from Kinshasa to Nairobi, he was told, don't worry, we only hire Belgian pilots. So he felt better after that. Visionary Companion says nothing puts an airline passenger's mind at ease like the motto, diversity is job one. Anwar says the U.S. started something like 80% of all wars from 1945 to 2000 or so. Burkin Sultanoff says Madeleine Albright is tweeting from hell right now. It seems now the dissident right have resorted to having boxing matches for money, says Oscar Ito. And, okay, Biden is propping up UKR so that it doesn't collapse and all the dirt on the Bidens comes out. Yes, I've thought that from the beginning, that President Zelensky probably knows an enormous amount about the Biden family, and that he is blackmailing the President of the United States. So that's it for today. I'll be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for tuning in. It is greatly appreciated. If you would like to make a donation to the live stream, my PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace at hotmail.com. If you're in Canada, donations may be made to the live stream directly via Interact at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this benediction in these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse. I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.